But there were cracks in the marble, unsettling details that the community politely ignored. He never married, deflecting offers with a tight smile and the phrase, "Justice is a jealous mistress." He kept no servants, maintaining his grandiose Greek Revival mansion alone, its spotless rooms lined with a library of legal and theological texts, with a disturbing emphasis on divine judgment and soul purification. Most peculiar was his obsession with prisoner transfers. In an era where judges gladly delegated the dirty work, Crawford insisted on handling every transfer to the state penitentiary personally. He refused deputies or marshals. "The law is a sacred trust," he would intone. "These men have been placed in my care by God and the people of Texas. I will see that they receive the treatment their souls require." It was seen as eccentric dedication, not a harbinger of nightmare. At the Methodist Church, his attendance was sparse but significant. Easter and Christmas, seated alone in the front pew, his rich baritone filling the hymns, his massive personal Bible open on his lap. He was a figure of solemn, solitary piety. The whispers said he was haunted by the war, a man who preferred the company of books and divine law to that of people. They called him disciplined, devoted. They did not call him what he was, a predator who had carefully built the perfect hunting ground. 3. The pattern in the shadows. The horror began quietly, in the bitter winter of 1866. It started with Thomas Burke, an Irish immigrant with dreams of bringing his family over from County Cork, convicted of stealing chickens. Crawford sentenced him to 2 years in the state penitentiary. Burke was led away in shackles. He was never seen again. Crawford's explanation was smooth and logical. He conducted transfers at night, to spare the men and the town a spectacle. He took pride, he said, in leaving no trace of these unpleasant necessities. The paperwork was flawless, filed with the state. The first thread was pulled, and no one noticed the tapestry beginning to unravel. But Martha Kellerman noticed. The courthouse cleaning woman, a war widow whose survival depended on discretion and hard work, was one of the few granted limited access to the upper basement levels for cleaning. What she saw disturbed her: stone chambers too finely crafted for mere storage, a strange, cloying smell beneath the basement's mustiness, a metallic tang like old blood, and the sharp, eye-watering scent of lime. And she heard. During Crawford's late-night vigils, sounds seeped through the stone, not the settling of timber, but muffled voices, cries, sobs of despair. When she timidly questioned the judge, he smiled patiently. "The acoustics are peculiar, Martha. Sound carries. It is likely the building settling, or rats in the walls." But Martha knew rats. And she knew fear. She began to keep a secret ledger, noting the names of the sentenced and the vanished. She recorded Crawford's excessive supply orders, enough hardtack, salt pork, and cornmeal to feed an army, not a handful of transient prisoners. She noted the medical supplies, laudanum, bandages, surgical tools. Crawford claimed he was nursing injured men back to health before transfer, a Christian duty. The charitable explanation was a veneer over something rotten. The smells grew worse, the sickly sweet odor of decay, the overwhelming chemical reek of lie. When Martha finally confronted him, his calm facade shattered for a single, terrifying instant. "Mrs. Kellerman," he hissed, his eyes like chips of flint, "focus on your cleaning duties. Leave the administration of justice to those qualified." The threat was clear. Martha retreated, but her ledger grew thicker. By spring of 1867, it contained 37 names. 37 men who had walked into Crawford's courtroom and disappeared from the earth. As the missing multiplied, a chorus of anguish rose from beyond Millfield. Wives and mothers, sisters and fathers, began arriving at the courthouse steps, clutching letters from state prisons that read the same damning line, "We have no record of this man's arrival." Their leader was Sarah Morrison, a woman of steely resolve and devout faith, whose husband Samuel, a Methodist deacon, had been convicted of grain theft and vanished. Sarah was not a woman to be placated by bureaucratic excuses. She launched her own investigation, traveling through dangerous territory to connect the dots between missing families. She discovered a damning pattern, from poor immigrant Thomas Burke to Benjamin Hawkins, son of a wealthy merchant, all shared one fate, a sentence from Judge Crawford, followed by oblivion. Sarah's findings, combined with Martha's clandestine notes, created a nucleus of resistance. A small group began meeting in the Methodist Church, praying for guidance and forging a plan. They were no longer supplicants, they were investigators. But they faced a monolithic foe. Crawford's authority was unquestioned, the local sheriff was his creature, and federal authorities dismissed their claims as the hysterics of backward folk. The standoff simmered through a wet spring, tension thickening the humid air. Crawford grew more reclusive, more defensive. The town was a pot about to boil over. It would take an unlikely spark to ignite it. That spark was Billy Tate. 19, illiterate, and dismissed as a simple-minded vagrant, Billy was convicted of horse theft and sentenced to 3 years. But Billy possessed a fox-like cunning and a wilderness-honed instinct for danger. From the moment he entered Crawford's domain, every nerve screamed predator. Unlike previous victims, Billy was taken to the true basement. What he discovered was a subterranean world of meticulously engineered horror. It was not a storage cellar, it was a prison complex, a labyrinth of stone chambers and corridors extending deep beneath the town square. Holding cells showed signs of long, brutal occupancy. And the sounds, the desperate, weeping voices of men begging for mercy or release from pain. Billy's survival instinct shifted from evasion to observation. He noted a loose stone in his cell wall. He watched Crawford's routines, saw the judge's nocturnal transformation from jurist to something else entirely. On his 3rd day, Crawford brought him to an examination chamber. The judge had shed his robes for a plain black cassock. The room was equipped with restraint chairs, surgical tools, and devices of torment disguised as instruments of penance. Here, Crawford unveiled his true theology. "The law of men is theater, William," he explained, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. "Here, we perform the true work, the purification of the soul through suffering. Pain is divine mercy. It burns away sin. Confess, and begin your journey to purity." In the broiling summer of 1867, as cicadas screamed in the pine forests, a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitmore rode a weary horse into the remote East Texas settlement of Millfield. His purpose was revival, to fan the faint embers of faith in a community time seemed to have forgotten. But what awaited him was not spiritual awakening, but a confrontation with a darkness so profound, it would test the very foundations of his belief. The town held a secret, locked behind the iron-barred windows and limestone walls of its proud new courthouse. Over the course of 18 long months, 89 souls had passed through its doors for sentencing and vanished from the face of the earth. Reverend Whitmore would become the reluctant architect of a terrible revelation, uncovering a truth so vile it had been buried by his own church for a century. This is not merely a story of crime. It is a story of a heresy of justice, a perversion of faith, and the haunting question of how a monster can be crafted in the image of a judge. To understand the horror, one must first understand the soil in which it grew. Millfield, Texas, was a phantom born from war's ashes. Approximately 40 miles southeast of Marshall, it lay cradled in the dense, shadowy pine forests of East Texas, a place of deep silence and deeper secrets. It emerged not as a beacon of hope during Reconstruction, but as a refuge. A haven for Confederate veterans carrying invisible wounds and tangible fears, men who wanted to be far from the victorious gaze of Federal bluecoats. Its population, never swelling beyond 400 souls, was bound by a shared understanding: the past was a private matter. In Millfield, you could shed your history like a worn-out coat. The town was the vision of Colonel James Millfield, a former cavalry officer with eyes as sharp as the money that purchased the land. He bought thousands of acres of timberland with a fortune he claimed was saved before the war. The truth, whispered over corn whiskey in Miller's saloon but never spoken in daylight, was darker. The money likely came from a plundered Union supply train, a final act of looting in the war's dying days. In the lawless vacuum of post-war Texas, such details were not points of inquiry but of survival. To question a man's provenance was to invite danger. The town itself was a simple grid etched into the wilderness, Main Street running east to west, 3 cross streets creating neat, hopeful blocks. It held the essentials: a general store smelling of dry goods and salt, a blacksmith's ringing anvil, the modest Pine Rove Inn, and Miller's Saloon, the true heart of male society where war stories fermented alongside cheap liquor. Homes were modest wooden affairs with porch swings and vegetable patches, testaments to honest poverty and simple dreams. And at the center of it all, incongruous and imposing, stood the courthouse. It was Judge Harrison Crawford's monument, commissioned by him in 1865 and built with an opulence that baffled the town's modest means. This was no rough frontier outpost of law. This was a Gothic Revival cathedral to justice, rising 3 stories in red brick and pale limestone, its pointed arches and ornate stonework speaking of an old-world severity. It dominated Millfield, a fortress of order in a land still raw with chaos. Its most remarked-upon feature was its basement. Unusually deep, with windows barely peeking above the earth, fitted with heavy iron bars. Judge Crawford's explanation was practical: the humid East Texas climate required secure, subterranean storage for sensitive legal documents and evidence. The bars were to deter thieves. No one questioned it. Why would they? The man who provided the explanation was not just their judge, he was their benefactor, the donor of the church land, the funder of the schoolhouse. He was Millfield's proof that they were not forgotten, that civilization had reached them. Judge Harrison Crawford was the human embodiment of his courthouse, imposing, impeccable, and fundamentally separate. He stood well over 6 feet, a mountain of a man with a cavalry officer's posture and a gaze like winter sky. His steel-gray hair was a masterpiece of discipline, his black robes forever unsullied by the pervasive red dust. When he spoke, it was in the cultured, rolling accents of a Virginia gentleman, a sound that commanded attention and signaled a world of learning far removed from the piney woods. He arrived with impeccable, forged credentials from the University of Virginia Law School and letters from fictitious Richmond attorneys. His knowledge of the law was breathtaking. He could recite Virginia Code and English common law with the ease of breathing. To the people of Millfield, his presence was a miracle, a titan of jurisprudence marooned in their humble midst. Billy, understanding the game was psychological, fed Crawford elaborate false confessions. He bought time. That night, as Crawford drank heavily and attended to another victim, Billy worked the loose stone free. He squeezed into a narrow drainage tunnel, crawling through pitch-black, water-filled passageways for what felt like an eternity, before emerging, gasping and filthy, behind the courthouse. He did not run. He went to the one person he knew would listen, Martha Kellerman. Arriving at her cabin in the pre-dawn gloom, trembling and covered in muck, he poured out his story, the chambers, the devices, the living prisoners, including Sarah Morrison's husband, Samuel. Martha heard the specific, undeniable details and knew the time for silent observation was over. 6. The confrontation. Martha mobilized the network. By midday, a group of 20 townspeople, armed with lanterns and a furious resolve, stood before the courthouse. Sarah Morrison led them. Crawford met them with condescension and legalistic deflection, calling Billy a liar and a fantasist. But Sarah stood firm. "Unlock the doors, Judge Crawford, or we will break them down. We are going into that basement today." Panic flashed behind Crawford's eyes. He retreated and returned with a shotgun, barricading himself inside. "I am the law here," he screamed, his voice unraveling. The standoff stretched through the afternoon. And then, as dusk fell, the soundproofing of his secret empire failed. From beneath the very feet of the gathered crowd came the unmuffled, unmistakable cries of men in agony. The crowd's suspicion crystallized into certain, collective horror. It was at this moment of chaos that Reverend Thomas Whitmore rode into town. Confronted not with a revival meeting but with a siege, the preacher's moral authority provided the final catalyst. "We cannot let fear of the law stop us from doing God's will," he thundered. "If men are suffering, we have a Christian duty to act." Axes and crowbars shattered the reinforced basement doors. The stench that billowed out, a vile cocktail of waste, decay, blood, and lime, sent several reeling. But the rest pressed on, their lanterns casting shaking light on a vision of hell. They found Crawford's life's work, an industrial-scale abattoir of the soul. Stone torture chambers with engineered devices for inflicting measured agony. Medical tables stained with unspeakable purposes. Holding cells where emaciated, broken men blinked in the sudden light. Among them was Samuel Morrison, a ghost of his former self. "Sarah," he whispered, the word a dry rasp. "Is it really you?" 37 men were found alive. 52 others were not. Their remains were discovered in lime pits in the deepest recesses, Crawford's final solution for the evidence of his divine work. The judge himself was found in his chambers, a suicide by laudanum and his service revolver, sprawled beside his greatest testament, volumes of handwritten journals. In precise, fervent script, they laid out his heretical creed. He wrote of being God's chosen instrument, of how superficial prison terms were meaningless. "True justice," he wrote, "is the purification of the corrupt soul through suffering. The pain I administer is not cruelty, it is salvation. I am not their punisher, I am their redeemer." 7. The aftermath and the echo. The immediate aftermath was a tidal wave of trauma. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from Marshall documented survivors suffering from catastrophic malnutrition, improperly healed fractures, and a psychological syndrome she had no name for, a combination of terror and a twisted, internalized version of Crawford's purification theology. Samuel Morrison would flinch at raised voices for the rest of his life, whispering about the necessity of suffering for grace. The town of Millfield shattered under the weight of its complicity. The courthouse was abandoned, left to crumble as a cursed place. The economy collapsed, the population scattered. Millfield became a ghost town, a monument to collective blindness. Reverend Whitmore compiled a meticulous, horrifying report for the Methodist Church. In 1867, the church made a fateful decision: they buried it. For a century, the full story of Judge Harrison Crawford, revealed to be Thomas Hartman, a rogue Confederate intelligence officer, was sealed away, deemed too damaging to faith, too horrific to acknowledge. Billy Tate, the simple hero, became an advocate for prison reform. Sarah and Samuel Morrison founded an organization to aid families of the missing. Martha Kellerman lived with the knowledge that her courage, though delayed, had saved lives. When the church archives were finally opened in 1967, a century later, Whitmore's report emerged not as a relic, but as a revelation. It provided criminologists with an early blueprint of the religiously motivated serial killer, and historians with a stark lesson on the corruption of absolute, unexamined authority. The field where the courthouse once stood is now a quiet memorial park. Each of the 89 victims has a stone. The lesson engraved there is not carved in granite, but hangs in the air: evil does not arrive shouting. It arrives speaking softly of duty, cloaked in the robes of authority, and quoting scripture. Its greatest trick is making good people believe that to question it is a sin. If this exploration of darkness hidden in plain sight resonates with you, if you seek the truths buried beneath the official stories, then you belong here. Subscribe, and join our community of seekers. Let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I read every one. And remember, the past is not a ghost. It is a teacher. Its darkest lessons are the ones we must never forget. If you're watching this while the world is quiet, just leave Crescent Moon.